Hello, and welcome to my channel. This video contains all of my responses so far to Ian Juby's Complete Creation series, but smushed together into one video, because some of you like one big, long video instead of a bunch of smaller ones. Couple of notes for this one: there were too many of the in-video link cards between all of the videos that are included in this one to actually put into this video. YouTube caps it at 5 max, so I put all of the cards into a playlist, as well as having the links in the description, along with timestamps so that you can cross-reference them and figure out which ones belong where in this video. Also worth mentioning is that towards the end, there's a lot of talk about old-timey geologist Charles Lyell. It's worth mentioning that I originally made these videos before I learned that Lyell actually wrote a paragraph in his work Principles of Geology, where he explained that his findings were perfectly compatible with a belief in a literal Noah's flood, just that the flood had to be so gentle as to not leave any mark on the geologic record. So keep that in mind as you listen to Juby rant about how much Lyell hated the Bible and sought to disprove it with his work. Anyway, on to the video!
Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video that was sent to me by Dale on my website. It is a recent-ish re-upload of an older creationist seminar called The Complete Creation, hosted by Ian Juby, an unfortunately Canadian creationist who runs a registered charity called Citizens for Origins Research and Education. Which I guess means that in Canada you can get tax-exempt status as a charity for teaching nonsense to children. That's unfortunate. Fortunately, they do seem to be on the decline. Their revenue has dropped from its peak of $37,000 in 2016 to $15,000 in 2018. Maybe I should register my channel as a charity. I provide free education targeted towards adults who have been miseducated or undereducated as children. Then all my patrons could get tax receipts, and I'd have to pay significantly less income tax. Huzzah! But yeah, that's not going to happen. Running a YouTube channel isn't exactly a humanitarian enough enterprise to warrant not paying taxes, in my opinion, and since I'm not religiously affiliated, I feel like I'd have to answer more questions about what I actually do to help before the government would bless me with charity status. Not to mention the fact that in order to get away with it, I'd have to basically register all the stuff I use for my channel, which includes my house, as property of the charity, and should my charity status ever be revoked, I'd have to either pay a huge chunk of tax on it, or give it to another charity. Or I could start a religion, the Church of Rhinoism. That'd be much easier. Anywho, that's a weird tangent to start on, so let's just jump in and take a look at the video.
Reading the Bible and taking its stories at face value seems to make some pretty outlandish claims.
Yeah, I'll say. Talking animals, real magicians, astrology, locusts that wear crowns and look like battle horses with people faces, lady hair, lion's teeth, and wings that sound like chariots, among other oddities.
Talks about a recent creation some 6,000 years ago. The first humans created as humans, and only one simple instruction given: don't eat the fruit on this one tree.
Sure, those things are strange, but at least they're a little bit intuitive.
A talking snake asked the two first humans, did God really say that?
The question it asked is not what makes it strange. It's the fact that it's a talking snake, and it's never said in the book to be anything other than just a snake that has the ability to talk. But snakes don't have the physical gear required to make human language sounds. That's what's strange about that part of the book.
Science would surely say that all the stories in the Bible were impossible nonsense.
Not all the stories, but a lot of them, maybe even most of them. Though they do become a lot more plausible if we remove the supernatural elements from them. Would a king steal a wife from one of his soldiers and then send that soldier to the front lines to die? Sure, that's entirely plausible. I'd be willing to bet that King David wasn't the only king to do such a thing. Though archaeological evidence for King David's existence is rather sparse, and if he did exist, his kingdom was probably not even close to being as big and powerful as it's depicted in the Bible. But if he existed, I have no doubt that the Bathsheba story could easily have its basis in a true event.
You know, the science that brought you microwave ovens, the internet, space travel, and amazing modern miracles of medicine.
I mean, those all come from different branches of science, but yes, scientific methodology has made our modern lives much more comfortable than any other time in history, even for some of the poorest among us. Access to the internet has been recognized globally as a human right since 2003, and along with internet access comes access to more information than anyone else in pre-internet history has ever had access to. Scientific methodology didn't get us here by appealing to supernatural powers. It was accomplished through naturalism.
The science that says the Earth is billions of years old. The science that says we humans evolved over many millions of years from ape-like creatures. The science that brought us the Big Bang and the dinosaurs.
Yep, all that knowledge thanks to scientific methodology.
Which science says aren't even mentioned in the Bible.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, in my opinion, they aren't mentioned in the Bible, but I could certainly see an argument being made that Behemoth and Leviathan were creations based on fossil finds. But the Middle East is not a great place to find fossils, so it's not very likely.
And that science says we have the fossils right here to show it.
Well, I mean, we don't have fossils that show dinosaurs not being mentioned in the Bible. That's just a silly statement on its face. But we do have fossils that demonstrate evolution pretty well, so there's that. And it's not just fossils either.
But did science really say this?
Well, science is not some monolithic institution. Science is a process. The scientific method has been used to discover evolution, dinosaurs, and everything else you mentioned, and it has conclusively demonstrated that several of the stories in the Bible, like Noah's flood, cannot possibly be literally true. But there is no one singular institution known as science which makes proclamations that we must abide by, which seems to be what you're describing.
You see, I love science. Started teaching it when I was 16 years old. I also love my Creator, whom I would contend is none other than the Lord Jesus Christ.
That is an interesting way to phrase that. Can you really say that you love your Creator if you don't know who that Creator is, if you can only contend that He is your Creator?
But I can't say I was always like that. It's a long story, but there was a time when I rejected Christ and was so angry with both Him and the words written in this book that I repeatedly whipped it against the wall in fits of rage.
Right, sure. I totally believe that. Like, seriously, do you actually expect people to believe that you were such an angry atheist who isn't really an atheist but is just someone who is mad at God, that you would have a fit of rage that had you throwing your book at the wall? You're painting your past self as a ridiculous Christian movie-style caricature of what an atheist actually is, and it's not believable. It may make the Christians who watch this feel more comfortable reaffirming their knowledge that atheists are really people who are just mad at God, but you're not going to change any atheist minds by presenting yourself this way. I mean, that's probably not your goal, so sure, I guess, but you're setting Christians up to be shocked when they meet people who are atheists who are not the stereotypical angry at God style atheists.
Maybe that's where you're at today, and I get it.
And then you pretend that you're directing this ridiculous story at atheists. I know many atheists. I do not know any who have been so mad at God that they have thrown a Bible at a wall. Now, maybe there are some out there somewhere who have legitimate anger management issues that may have thrown a Bible at a wall in anger over something, but that's not the norm. And just out of curiosity, I posted a poll on Twitter asking my atheist followers how many of them have been mad enough at God that they threw a Bible at a wall. And within 6 minutes of posting the poll, I got a bunch of responses from atheists pointing out that they can't be mad at something that they don't think exists. I almost wish I had turned off replies for that one, because now my notifications are going to be destroyed for the day. Future Rhino cutting in to follow up. That poll made it outside of my core audience, and I had a bunch of atheists angrily replying to me that it's a malformed question. Of course they aren't mad at something they don't believe in. Why would I even phrase it that way? It's utterly ridiculous. So, yeah, my most popular Twitter poll ever now has a bunch of atheists thinking that I'm a Christian apologist getting ratioed.
Now, I understand why some of you will look at me like I'm some kind of conspiracy nut who also has two heads or something. I get it. After all, How can you deny science?
That image is quite possibly one of the most misunderstood images in all of scientific history. Now, maybe not, maybe that's a bit hyperbolic, but it seems that way to me. So here's the deal with that. It is an oversimplified picture whose original intent was to simply show the similarities between the species that eventually led to humans. It was originally published in the Early Man volume of the Life Nature Library, and it was a 4-page foldout, not the simplified 5-species image that we usually see. The author of the book understood that evolution was not a linear progression, and each of the species in the progression had different descriptions for them, and several made it clear that the author was entirely aware that those species are not actually our ancestors, they just represent what our ancestors from that time might have looked like. But it is being misused by creationists who point to it as an example of what evolutionists believe, and it's being misused by non-creationists who point to it and declare that it's completely unscientific. The way creationists use it, yes, it is completely unscientific. But if you go take that book out of a library and actually read it, it's not unscientific. Though, having been authored more than 50 years ago, it is outdated.
But let me start right there. This simple chart we've all seen, so eloquently depicting the fossil evidence of the evolutionary ascent of ape-like creature to man, the vast majority of people do not know that this fossil sequence is only found in 3 places on the entire planet.
I haven't watched ahead yet, but I'm guessing he's about to say textbooks, museums, and something else. But the thing is, we don't expect to find a fossil sequence where the older one is buried in the strata immediately below the younger ones in a perfect succession, as seems to be the implication here. But we do find these fossil sequences when we properly date the strata that they are found in. Not exactly the sequence depicted in that image, and we are aware that few, if any, of the depicted organisms are in our line of ancestry, but the sequence itself is real.
Textbooks, museum displays, and the imaginations of people.
Oh, creationists are so predictable.
This sequence does not exist in physical form anywhere on this planet. In fact, if you were to accurately depict in graphical form what we actually find, it would look like this.
I don't know what that's even supposed to represent, but here's an actual image of the specimens that we have, graphed with their temporal distribution. If this is what you're going for, it's not hard to find. But it's not as easy to digest for someone who's not particularly interested in the subject, whereas the March of Progress image is, though the erroneous understanding it is likely to leave them with is admittedly problematic.
And the interpretation of many of the alleged half-ape, half-human fossils are controversial even among die-hard adherents to evolution.
Are you referring to the fact that some of them fit so perfectly between 2 different categories that we can't agree which category they properly belong in? Because that does happen, and it's actually to be expected, since nature doesn't conform to our arbitrary categorization system. If creation were true, though, it would not be expected. According to creation, God invented the categories. They are not arbitrary, so it should be perfectly easy to categorize organisms based on the categories that God created. But it's not. It's more of a gradient that completely ignores our human attempts at organization.
As a matter of fact, you'll get to see that some of these alleged half-ape, half-human ancestors really are half-ape, half-human, because they mixed human fossils with ape fossils to reconstruct these skeletons.
Taking bets now that he's referring to Piltdown Man, the hoax that was discovered to be a hoax largely because of our increasing understanding of human evolution.
They made a Frankenstein chimera and then claimed it to be proof of evolution. How could science be so wrong?
Being wrong is how we learn. Piltdown Man is a special case because it was a deliberate forgery, but science advances largely by being wrong and then figuring out why we were wrong. The fact that you would even ask that question in that way demonstrates that you don't understand the scientific method.
Now, being a vocal proponent of true science, I would like to start this series right there.
And let me just stop you in your tracks right there. Creationism is not true science. Science is a process of discovery. Creationist scientists don't often follow the scientific method, instead choosing to start with their desired conclusions and only looking at data that can potentially lead to those conclusions to the exclusion of the majority of the data that actually falsifies their conclusions. That is not true science.
Because we can't determine what science says or does not say until we even know what science is. And unfortunately, there's an incredible amount of ignorance on that very topic. I lay the responsibility for that at the feet of the self-proclaimed science educators.
That's a rather broad brush, wouldn't you say? I mean, if it turns out that creationism is somehow correct despite all the evidence to the contrary, then wouldn't that make all the creationist speakers, such as yourself, science educators? So isn't being a science educator something that you are actively trying to do right now? The main difference I've seen is that science educators who don't have an agenda, like proving a young Earth, for example, often encourage their viewers to check up on them. Don't take their word for it, look at the sources, learn how to critically evaluate scientific materials to find out if there are any shenanigans going on. Now, certainly there are creationists who make a show of doing something like this. Mike Riddle and his fuzzy words come to mind, but you'll notice that his criticisms are rather insubstantial. He likes to play word games and complains about the choice of language in what are usually popular science reporting articles rather than actual scientific papers. I have yet to see a creationist actively encourage anyone to do any sort of thorough checking on their sources, unless that source is the Bible, and even then, not often. Hell, one of my favorite podcasts is The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and a repeating theme on that show is that one of the co-hosts will get excited about some really cool implication that's being promoted as the result of some study or other, followed by Dr. Stephen Novella immediately stepping in and pointing out that this implication is almost pure speculation, and it's incredibly unlikely to pan out that way. How many shows go out of their way to quash excitement on a scientific issue because they are more concerned with accuracy than about presenting sensationalist content that will get clicks?
PBS, National Geographic, the National Center for Science Education, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, and the likes.
Yeah, there's a lot of good scientific material that can be found from all of those sources. And while most of those are not sources that I keep tabs on, I am aware of several of them changing their positions on sometimes major topics based on new information. Bill Nye's chapter on GMOs in his book Undeniable comes to mind immediately. Not sure I would say that any of those are self-proclaimed science educators. Several of those are institutions, and science education is certainly a part of those institutions' goals, but it's not like they just showed up and said, "We're here to educate people on science," and so everyone listened. They earned their reputations. Some more than others. National Geographic isn't quite as reputable as it used to be. It's still pretty good, but I tend to be more skeptical of their articles the more recent they are.
Interestingly, with each of these individuals or groups, you can see their historic descent into madness when they attempt to defend the theory of evolution.
Yup, we all a bunch of crazies down here. Join us.
Room for one more.
They inevitably contradict and otherwise refute themselves while proclaiming bold statements that reveal their glaring ignorance on what science even is.
And I'm sure you have many examples that definitely won't have context removed at all.
This descent into madness happens because, as you will see shortly, in order to defend the theory of evolution, you must deny true science.
Yeah, that's a nefarious little setup. Who is the gatekeeper of true science? You? I know your answer would probably be God, but God doesn't seem to speak for himself, at least not anymore. Yeah, Bible, but the Bible doesn't actually say much on science, and when it does, it's usually wrong. So science needs someone to dictate what is true science and what isn't. And since God no longer speaks for himself, he needs his representatives on earth to speak for him. That's what you're proposing, isn't it? Except really, true science doesn't rely on dictates from an authority. It is a process. Anyone can do science. We've just reached a point in our scientific advancement where most of the low-hanging fruit has been picked, so in order to actually do any meaningful work in a scientific field, you have to specifically study that field for a few years first, just to get your understanding to a point where you are even capable of making your own contributions.
Now, a couple of years back, I saw a meme on the internet. An alleged quote attributed to Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'll be honest with you. When I first saw the meme and read the quote, this is the meme that came to mind.
Okay, sure, I get that. Maybe he wasn't the first person to say it, but he certainly did say it.
We debated global warming. Two of the people did not believe in it. Oh, no, one person didn't believe in it. Two of them didn't believe in evolution.
The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it. You see, that's the... I'm just saying.
That's very good.
Thing is, though, even if he wasn't the first person in history to say that phrase, it's still a true statement.
Like the Abraham Lincoln meme, I honestly figured some internet troll had made what he thought was a profound argument, slapped deGrasse Tyson's name on it to give it authority. The alleged quote was profoundly nonsensical.
How is it nonsensical? I mean, sure, it's a quick soundbite that oversimplifies the issue, but the universe operates with the same principles whether or not you believe in those principles doesn't quite have the same ring to it. Like I said, science is a process, but there is such a thing as the scientific body of knowledge, which is the collective body of knowledge that we have scientifically verified at this point in history, and I suspect that that is what he was referring to with that quote. It was actually specifically about evolution. Bill Maher had just mentioned having two people on the show that don't believe in evolution, to which Tyson replied with that quote. Given that the current body of scientifically verified knowledge includes the theory of evolution, I'd say it was an appropriate reply.
I didn't actually believe deGrasse Tyson said this until I saw and heard him say it. It was during an interview with left-wing extremist Bill Maher on Real Time, produced by HBO.
I know you guys like your labels, but Bill Maher's is a hard one to pin down. He does tend to favor left-wing positions on most issues, but he also holds some positions that would have some people calling him a racist right-wing xenophobe. He holds some positions which I very much agree with, and he holds some that I very much do not agree with. It's almost like people are more than just the political labels that they can sometimes have applied to them. But yeah, you guys like your us versus them.
Notice the subtlety of Maher bringing up evolution, and deGrasse Tyson then sneakily swapping out the word evolution and replacing it with the word science.
Well, the conversation started with climate change and then pivoted to evolution, so it's not so much that he was sneakily swapping words, it's that science is a word that encompasses both topics, so was an appropriate word to use. But my question here would be, why are you bothering to attack some science communicator if true science is actually on your side?
He then swaps out the word science for the word truth.
No, he didn't swap it. He used true as an adjective to describe science. If I say that my van is blue, whether you believe it or not, I didn't swap out the word blue for van. I used the word blue to describe my van, because that's how adjectives work.
This is significant. deGrasse Tyson butchers science as a whole with a completely nonsensical statement that betrays his apparent ignorance on what science is and is not.
Sure. Ian Juby, the creationist with no apparent credentials, at least not any I could find, knows more about what science is than a man with a PhD and Master of Philosophy degree, both in astrophysics, whose work on the Kalin-Tololo supernova survey helped establish Type 1a supernovae as standard candles. Sorry, but as a guy that also has no credentials, I'm going to go ahead and trust the guy who has actually done science that you can go and look up and read right now, over the guy who hasn't, when it comes to describing what science is.
Science cannot be truth.
No, because science is a process. However, scientific knowledge can be true. Now, he goes on to use quotes from other scientists who mention the fact that science is a self-correcting process to claim that Neil deGrasse Tyson obviously doesn't know what he's talking about when he said that science is true, and I don't want to just keep harping on how he was probably referring to that specific scientific knowledge. After all, science is a self-correcting process. It has no authorities. If deGrasse Tyson said something incorrect, then he is incorrect. End of story. Doesn't make evolution any less of a fact, it just makes Neil deGrasse Tyson wrong. Since this point is so very inconsequential, I'm just skipping the rest of it.
So what deGrasse Tyson currently thinks this truth is today may not be truth to him next week in light of new evidence.
Which is the correct attitude to have. Word games aside, your point seems to be that this scientist said something that was phrased sloppily once, therefore we can't trust anything he says, so when he says evolution is a fact, he must be wrong. Stop attacking people, start attacking ideas. DeGrasse Tyson could come out as a creationist tomorrow, and it would not change the fact that evolution happens. So just stop wasting your energy on this.
To defend the anti-science dogma of evolutionism, without even realizing it, you fall into illogical and irrational rhetoric. You must reject true science and embrace the science falsely so called that the Apostle Paul mentioned.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up, because now I can point out that this Bible verse is listed specifically on Creation.com's list of arguments that they don't think creationists should use. Though it certainly is worth pointing out that if you actually read through the list, most of the arguments on the list start with a paragraph explaining why it's a bad argument, followed by a second paragraph explaining how they believe the argument is true, it just won't get you to creationism. Sounds kind of like motivated reasoning to me.
For example, science is strictly limited to the natural realm.
As it should be. Though not all scientists feel this way. I mean, how many times do we need to do studies on the efficacy of prayer? Every time it's done, atheists hold up the studies as evidence against the supernatural, while the religious engage in post hoc rationalization, explaining how prayer actually does work, but you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, so it won't work when you test it. So no matter the results of the study, it doesn't convince anyone, and yet somehow these studies keep being funded by places like the Templeton Foundation.
It cannot measure or study your emotions or even your thoughts.
Tell that to the psychologists and neurologists.
We cannot scientifically study what is outside of nature.
Yeah, it is hard to scientifically study something that can't even be scientifically demonstrated to exist in the first place.
Though scientific study may point to the extranatural.
How would it do that? Have any studies been published that have pointed to the supernatural, or extranatural as you're calling it? Just asserting it does not make it true.
For example, it may come as a shock to my evolutionist friends that you believe in the supernatural.
That would be a shock if it were actually true, but asserting that you know what is going on inside someone else's head is never a good way to convince that person that your position is right. It's more likely to end up convincing that person that you are obviously wrong, since they know for certain that your assertion about what's going on in their heads is wrong. And this is one clue that the video is directed at people who already believe, rather than at the non-believers, as creationists are likely familiar with verses in the Bible that assert that everyone actually believes in God, even if they are suppressing it, while the non-believer can actually look to their own thoughts and beliefs and see that they don't actually believe. So you're reinforcing belief among believers in a way that is not likely to convince any non-believers.
Molecules to man evolution, popularly taught at all levels of education, must violate several well-established scientific laws of nature.
Let me guess, thermodynamics and biogenesis? Or are you going to take it all the way back to the Big Bang and assert that the singularity had some property or other that you have no way of actually verifying, but it seems intuitive, so you rely on intuition instead of evidence? It's always some trick like this with creationists. But even if his statement is correct, if evolution violated something that had previously been established as a scientific law, that would not mean that evolution is supernatural. That would mean that we had a flawed understanding of either evolution or that natural law, or both. Admitting that mistakes are possible is not automatically a position of belief in the supernatural.
Such as biogenesis and the second law of thermodynamics.
So predictable.
Well, if a process violates a scientific law of nature,
then that means one of three things. Our understanding of the law is flawed, our understanding of that process is flawed, or some combination of the first two. In this case, it's actually nearly impossible to figure out which one you're misunderstanding. It's likely a combination of everything. That is in perfect harmony with evolution, which is itself a function of reproduction. And for thermodynamics, not only does life not violate thermodynamics, I mean, after all, the Earth has a massive energy input from the sun, which allows for a localized temporary reversal of entropy, but it has been proposed that the development of life is an expected outcome of the laws of thermodynamics, as a planet with life converts available energy into entropy faster than a planet with no life. So this view holds that thermodynamics predicts that life would arise as a more efficient mechanism of increasing entropy than non-life.
then by definition it is neither scientific nor natural.
How arrogant do you have to be to assume that you know enough about all of the various mechanisms of the universe to state categorically that if something doesn't seem to add up to you, that must therefore mean that it is scientifically impossible?
Molecules demand evolution, by very definition, is a supernatural process.
You do realize that you are made of molecules, right? I mean, hell, ignore us. Trees basically build their bodies out of air. Their main source of carbon is air, and their trunks are made out of mostly carbon. Trees literally build the materials that we use to build houses out of thin air. But the idea that we are made of molecules is just too much for you.
Now, you are welcome to contend that the first life arose from non-life.
It did. And that does not violate biogenesis, as biogenesis was specifically about complex life, like maggots, mold, flies, and the like. The first life would have been very simple, so simple that we might not even recognize it as life.
But that is not scientific.
How so? We have evidence of a time on Earth when there was no life. There is life now. Life must have come from somewhere. Life is made out of chemicals and compounds that can occur naturally. So it is reasonable to assume that life at some point developed from the chemicals and compounds that make up life. How exactly did this happen? Well, we have some ideas, but we don't know for sure yet. To assert that you do know for sure is what would be unscientific.
That violates the law of biogenesis established by observation since the beginning of scientific study.
No, biogenesis was specifically the counter to the idea of spontaneous generation, which was the idea that fully formed and complex life could arise from rotting food spontaneously. Biogenesis was established by Louis Pasteur by boiling broth in a special flask. Are you seriously trying to suggest that boiling broth, and then seeing that if you keep it isolated it doesn't cloud, somehow demonstrates that the formation of simple protocells and proto-life in prebiotic conditions which would have been nothing like the boiled broth is impossible? Because I can tell you that Pasteur's experiments didn't even attempt to answer the question of the origin of life, just the origin of certain organisms that like rotting food. One of the popular creationist arguments against the Miller-Urey experiments is that they didn't accurately recreate the conditions of the early Earth, which is true, but they demonstrated a mechanism by which amino acids could potentially form naturally, and we have since found many more mechanisms and have even found naturally occurring amino acids on meteorites. So the conclusion of the Miller-Urey experiment has been demonstrated to be valid, but creationists attack it for its inaccurate environment. Well, how is boiled broth a better representation of the primordial Earth than what Miller and Urey set up?
You would be venturing beyond what science can study because life has only ever been observed to arise from previous life.
Yes, but scientists and creationists alike all agree that life had an origin at some point. There was a time when there was no life on Earth. We disagree on when that was and how long it lasted, but we can all agree that it is a true statement that there once was no life on Earth. So everyone agrees that life had an origin, and several plausible natural pathways that could lead to life have been proposed. So to just assert that the origin of life had to be supernatural seems rather unjustified. Do you have evidence that it couldn't have been natural? Like actual evidence, not boiled broth?
Now, the theory of special creation and the theory of evolution both inevitably venture into the supernatural.
Incorrect. Special creation certainly does, but evolution only goes there if you start off with a gross misunderstanding of the science. Now, do you see what I did there? I used science as a noun to simplify the statement, body of scientific knowledge. See how I can understand that science is a process and still be able to use the word as a stand-in for a larger string of words?
Creation and evolution are both attempts to use science to answer the four great questions of life. Who am I?
24601. Evolution doesn't answer that question. That's a question for you to answer yourself.
Where did I come from?
Well, as Ramstein so eloquently put it, you have a P word, I have a D word. So what's the problem? Let's do it quick. Nobody tell Ben Shapiro about that song. It'll blow his poor little mind.
Bring a bucket and a mop for this wet-ass P word.
Why am I here?
See the answer to where did I come from? Now, if you mean what is the purpose to your life, then again, that's something you get to decide for yourself, and evolution doesn't have anything to do with that.
And where am I going?
Today? Nowhere. It's movie night, so we stay in and watch a movie with the kids. With my life? Anywhere I want. See the answer to the previous question. Evolution doesn't attempt to answer any of these at all. If we're looking at these questions scientifically, the answers are all quite dull. If we're looking at them philosophically, you can answer them however you like, but the only question that the theory of evolution even attempts to answer is, how did the species on the planet get so diverse? Now, certainly in seeking to answer this question, many more questions and answers have come up, but that is the big one at the base of evolutionary biology.
The two models of creation or evolution exhaust all other possibilities. Our origins will be found in one of these two models.
If you're including abiogenesis in the theory of evolution, then yes, the origin of life was either a chemical reaction or magic. Since we see that the continuation of life can be broken down to a series of cascading chemical reactions, and we have never seen a demonstrable example of magic, my money's on the chemical reaction.
For example, there are some who claim that we were genetically engineered here on Earth by aliens.
Well, I am sure that there are people out there that believe this. Usually, actual aliens designing us are proposed as a hypothetical that is used to point out that they would have still had to have developed through some kind of evolutionary mechanisms first. So we still have all the same questions as before the aliens, so there's no real benefit to proposing aliens. Alternatively, panspermia is the idea that some of the ingredients for life formed off-planet and came to the Earth through meteor and asteroid impacts. This is more plausible than actual alien designers, and we know it's possible because we've seen it happen.
It merely brings up the question, where did the aliens come from?
Oh yeah, you got us. No one's ever thought of that one before. Checkmate, we lose. We should all be creationists now. I'm so glad you thought of that.
Attacking those who present scientific evidence is by definition anti-science behavior.
Well, good thing I'm not attacking you. I try to focus on the science being presented, and what I find is that on the creationist side, the arguments rely almost entirely on quote mining, cherry picking, and misrepresentation.
And I challenge you to find even one observed example in all of scientific history of macroevolution.
Okay. How about when a species of unicellular algae developed the trait of multicellularity as a defense mechanism against a filter-feeding amoeba? That's a pretty big evolutionary step, one of the ones that creationists love to bring up as being completely impossible, but it took the algae less than a year. There's also E. coli, which developed the ability to metabolize citrate. I know that doesn't sound impressive, but E. coli is pretty much defined by the fact that it does not metabolize citrate. So this evolution to take advantage of a new food source is really quite significant. So there, you asked for one, I gave you two. And there's more. Macroevolution, when the term is used scientifically, simply means evolution above the level of species, which is a rather arbitrary line, but it works. There are long lists that are easy to find of observed speciation events, so macroevolution by definition. But yeah, nothing that fits the creationist misdefinition of macroevolution like a moth growing a scorpion tail. You know, the kind of thing that creationists have been told repeatedly is not predicted by the theory of evolution, and so observation of such an event would actually be a step in the direction of falsifying the theory as a whole?
With the two conflicting models of creation and evolution, we may not be able to prove one model or the other, but we can certainly disprove or falsify one of them.
Yes, we certainly can. Now, guess which one has been thoroughly falsified? I went into detail on that in my Evolution Stole My Cookies video, so I'm not rehashing that here, but spoiler, it was not evolution that was falsified. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Gear Smoke, who says, "This might be a stupid question, but if internal pregnancies are unique to mammals, then what are viviparous, live-bearing fish and snakes doing?" Well, Gear Smoke, that's actually not a stupid question at all. It's an excellent question. I misspoke. I really should have known better since, I'm in the process of setting up a guppy breeding tank for my son. Guppies, the live-bearing fish. I was actually surprised to learn that viviparity, or internal pregnancy, has actually evolved about 150 times independently in vertebrates, and it's thought that viviparity is a mechanism that stimulates diversity. Something about internal pregnancies makes it easier for that species to diversify than one that lays eggs. With fish, there are two major factors that probably account for this. One single viviparous female can colonize a new watershed by herself, if she were fertilized before ending up there, while an oviparous female would need to end up in the new watershed with an appropriate mate. And since geographic isolation is one of the main driving factors of diversity, this makes sense. There's also a higher survival rate for the fry, or baby fish, for viviparous fish. The stage where they are just sitting there as an egg, just waiting for a predator to come along and chomp them, is skipped completely.
And so ends part 1. Part 2 begins now.
Hello, and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, we're looking at the second part of Ian Juby's Complete Creation series. Remember Ian? He's the guy with the vesticles? I'm hoping that part 1 was so focused on superficial details like correct word usage and quick quips because part 1 was just supposed to be introductory, so he's saving the actual scientific points for the rest of the series. I'm not holding out much hope, but any hope is hope, right?
Welcome back and thank you for joining me again in this series where we show you the information the anti-creationists don't want you to see or hear.
Oh, okay. That facade didn't last very long. Remember in part 1 where you were pretending to direct these videos at non-believers?
It's a long story, but there was a time when I rejected Christ and was so angry with both him and the words written in this book that I repeatedly whipped it against the wall in fits of rage. Maybe that's where you're at today.
So I guess you've just completely given up on even presenting the facade of trying to appeal to non-believers then?
Let's start today by looking at the physical, scientific evidence and the very important history of the creation-evolution debate.
The history of the debate, while it may be interesting, is largely irrelevant if you have actual modern physical evidence. The only reason that the history of the debate could be relevant is if, instead of looking at evidence, you plan on pointing at scientists of the past, showing that they had similar beliefs about the age of the Earth as you do, therefore they must have been right because those are the guys that made scientific discoveries.
You see, it wasn't that long ago, not even 150 years ago, where the consensus of the scientific community was that this book, the Bible, was a literal history book of the world, the universe, and all of life.
I'm not sure if it was actually the scientific consensus. I've only ever heard that claim from creationists. Now, certainly there was more uncertainty about the age of the Earth before we, figured out how to directly measure the ages of rocks and things. But really, the religious beliefs of scientists are irrelevant to the scientific work that they do. Archimedes laid the groundwork for basically all of modern math and physics, and the consensus among scientists of his time was likely that the Greek creation story involving Zeus, the Titans, and their war was accurate. Though, to be fair, the ancient Greeks don't seem to have had the same literalness boner that modern creationists have, so they probably didn't think that those events were just flat out literally true as presented. But regardless, does this somehow color how we calculate the volume of a sphere? No? Why not, you ask? Well, perhaps it's because the religious beliefs of scientists are irrelevant to the science that they are doing. Unless, of course, the religious beliefs are having an effect on how they are doing the science. If you insist that your religion has to have an Earth that is less than 10,000 years old, that is going to color your results when dealing in scientific fields that are relevant to the age of the Earth.
There was no conflict between the claims of this book and the scientific evidence they dealt with every day.
No, there was plenty of conflict between the evidence and the young Earth creationist viewpoint. Now, they may not have had access to as much evidence as we have today, so it was easier to misinterpret the evidence that they did have, but as time went on, it became more and more clear that the Earth was not just 6,000 years old. Now, I'm skipping a bunch because he literally just names a bunch of famous scientists of history, like Newton, and claims that they were all young Earth creationists. I doubt this claim, but I don't feel it's worth putting time into researching it for all of these names, as at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Like, sure, I could nitpick that Newton likely didn't believe in the Trinity and so isn't a flavor of Christian that he probably would even recognize as Christian nowadays, and he probably could have accomplished a lot more actual science than he did if he hadn't been so focused on things like alchemy, but ultimately, calculus works regardless of how much other nonsense the guy who invented it believed. The laws of motion work, even though he believed that the Bible predicted the end of the world sometime after 2060. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. How many of the scientists does he list that did work that was actually important to figuring out the age of the Earth or evolution? Almost none of them worked in fields that were even relevant to the age of the Earth, and a few of them, like Steno and Linnaeus, laid some important groundwork to discoveries that directly contradict young Earth creationism. Also, a good chunk of them were Roman Catholic, meaning that had they been around today, they likely would accept evolution and an old Earth, seeing as how the Catholic Church's official position is that evolution happened and the Earth is old.
If creation were true, if this world and universe had been created as the Bible indicates, what would the scientific evidence be?
Well, for starters, when dating rocks, we wouldn't be able to find any older than 6,000 years. When looking at the sky, we wouldn't be able to see any stars that are more than 6,000 light years away. If not all animals, at least humans would be designed in a way that didn't look like it was cobbled together out of evolutionary leftovers. Genetic analysis would not show relationships between organisms that were independently created, with the exception of maybe some common functions that are shared between them. I could go on.
So, if creation were true, what would the evidence be? We would expect to find evidence that the Earth and even the universe is young, in the 6,000 to 10,000 year range.
Correct. And since we can date rocks to billions of years old and see stars who are far enough away from us that their light would take billions of years to reach us, we see the opposite.
Now, the age of the universe becomes tricky because you have what is called time dilation involved there. Time runs at different speeds at different places in the universe.
Yeah, and taking that into account, we can use the equations behind the theory of general relativity to derive the Friedmann equation, which has a collection of variables that represent time. So, if you use the Friedmann equation to solve for time at t = 0, then you end up with the age of the universe. It's a calculation based on a scientific theory that even creationists accept. You have to accept it in order to be able to accept time dilation, and it gives us an age for the universe of about 14 billion years, which is a bit older than the current consensus of 13.8 billion years. There are reasons for this, but it gets really complicated really fast, so suffice it to say for now that the evidence points to the universe being at least 13.8 billion years old.
We would expect to find evidence that life on Earth is young.
And since we have a living organism that is still alive today that is at least 80,000 years old, we see that creationism is incorrect. So we're 0 for 2 so far?
It states that God created life to reproduce after their kind. So, if creation were true, we should see limited variation within species as they faithfully reproduce after their kind.
Yes, and this one isn't quite as simple as the last two, because creationists often don't like to be specific about what a kind is. Sometimes they'll say it's animals that can bring forth together, but then that doesn't work very well with the creationist idea that lions and house cats are the same kind, as I doubt very much that it would be possible for them to bring forth, but they have to do that in order to fit more animals on the ark in less actual animals. Some creationists will put the distinction at one taxonomic rank or another, sometimes I've heard the family suggested, but this creates problems with other animals that are clearly related but in a different family, not to mention the fact that it makes humans the same kind as all the other great apes. Why bother denying evolution if you're going to say that humans are the same kind as chimps anyway? So, really, we need an actual working definition of what a kind is, and a method of determining if two different species are in fact the same kind definitively, and then we can figure out whether things only reproduce after their kind or not.
We would expect to find all of life scattered throughout the historical and fossil records from the beginning, as according to the Bible, all of life was created within a single literal week.
Yup. You would expect, as you look in the fossil record, that there would not be any particular order to the fossils if they weren't all created at the same time. But as we examine the fossil record, we do find them in a particular order, and always in the same order, no matter where you look.
So we should see evidence that, say, man and dinosaurs lived contemporaneously.
Yeah, like a fossilized human in the same stratum as a fossilized dinosaur. But we've never found that.
Now, one more significant point of evidence comes from Genesis chapter 7, where it records a worldwide flood that destroyed all of life that breathes air.
Okay, but you're jumping the gun here a bit. You're trying to provide evidence for creation over evolution. Creation itself does not say anything about a flood. I know most creationists come pre-packaged with the assumption that if their creation story is true, then so was the flood story, but it's actually a whole new claim. Now, the short answer is no, there is not evidence of a worldwide flood. But the long answer is no. There is not evidence of a worldwide flood. Okay, I'm kidding a bit there. It actually involves the same question, repeated specifically for the flood instead of creation, and whether or not there was a flood 4,000 years ago has no impact on whether or not evolution happens, so it's irrelevant here.
If a global flood happened in Earth's historic past, you can kiss the entire theory of evolution goodbye. That theory has been obliterated, scientifically falsified.
How so? Is there something about alleles changing frequencies in a population over generations that speaks to whether or not there was a global flood 4,000 years ago? No, there isn't. Now, if there was a flood as described by the Bible just 4,000 years ago, which killed off all but 2 of every land animal, then we would not expect to see the biodiversity of the planet to have quite recovered to where it is today, so our observations of evolution do demonstrate that no such flood occurred, but there is nothing about the theory of evolution that states that a worldwide flood is impossible. Evolution is biology, after all. Floods are not. There's no reason evolution would say anything about floods, aside from them being parts of the environment that an organism lives in, and therefore part of the selection pressures.
You cannot overstate that point.
You can, and you have.
Our final point would be that if a global flood happened, even remotely close to the description in Genesis chapter 7, then there will be evidence. That's not a maybe. That's a fact.
Yes. And since there isn't any evidence for it, and there is a plethora of evidence against it, then this one is also wrong.
So, here we have a good string of evidence to look for to affirm or refute the biblically based creation model.
And every single one has been found lacking, except for the one that relies on the ambiguousness of the definitions of one of its words to stay afloat. Not looking so good for creation right now. I'm skipping his question of what the evidence would be if evolution were true. It's basically the same question but reversed. Evidence that the Earth is very old, the order of the fossils, etc. I'd like to skip past the rhetoric and get to the, actual evidence. He also attacks Darwin, bringing up the fact that Darwin didn't come up with evolution in a vacuum and was operating with knowledge of previous works by other scientists who had similar ideas. Yeah, that's how science works. But we're supposed to revere Darwin as if he were a religious figurehead. So the idea that his ideas could have had their origin in other scientists that aren't him must be totally crushing to us poor evolutionists.
Now, as it turns out, not only is natural selection compatible with the biblical account of creation, contrary to what Darwin proposed, natural selection is the nemesis of evolution.
How does that follow at all? Natural selection is literally one of the primary mechanisms of evolution. Evolution would not work without it. That's like saying, not only is your car's engine compatible with the grease stain on your seat from that burger you ate the other day, but contrary to what the engineers at your car company propose, your car's engine is actually the nemesis of your car.
We'll look at that in detail probably around lecture 15.
Maybe I'll skip ahead to that one for my next response, because, my tendency to lose interest in these long presentation series things before it gets to that point.
But before Darwin's time, in the preceding centuries, there was a very few people who believed, various forms of evolutionary theory. In fact, there were some even before the time of Christ.
Yeah, Anaximander, Empedocles, Hippocrates, and Lucretius all lived before Jesus, and they all developed some form of rudimentary evolution.
But let's just say that such people were very much considered on the fringe. Unscientific nut jobs, to be frank.
I don't think I've ever heard Anaximander, Empedocles, Hippocrates, or Lucretius described as being unscientific nut jobs before now. Certainly they believe some things that sound ridiculous to us today, but given that they lived more than 2,000 years ago, it's quite understandable. But to call them nut jobs just kinda demonstrates that you are not interested in an unbiased examination of the facts. You are instead interested in poisoning the well against someone who accepted any form of evolution in history, no matter how similar or different their version of evolution may have been from Darwin's version. And when I come back, I will have skipped a bunch of his video again, because after mentioning that other people thought of variations of evolution before Darwin, he is at this point bringing up the fact that Darwin's only higher education credential was in theology, while comparing that to the fact that a bunch of very influential figures in the history of Christianity were educated as lawyers, as if that somehow strengthens his position. If anything, I'd say it weakens it. Part of a lawyer's job is often to craft convincing arguments for positions that they don't necessarily hold themselves. That kind of makes the point that I've often presented, that the very existence of the field of apologetics is evidence that the religion is not true. And ultimately, Darwin's credentials are irrelevant anyway. The vast majority of well-qualified biologists with any credential you like, which have existed since Darwin, have agreed that evolution happens. So Darwin's qualifications don't really matter at this point.
His name was Sir Charles Lyell, and he became known not as a great lawyer, but as one of the founding fathers of the modern science of geology.
Okay, so I just realized that with all the stuff I skipped, that statement will come across a little bit weird. He has just finished pointing out that Martin Luther, Charles Finney, and John Calvin, some very prominent figures in church history, didn't have any theological qualifications, but were instead trained as lawyers. A fact that weakens his attack on other people's qualifications, as it just essentially serves to show that the educational system was very different in the 19th century and before than it is today. Either that, or it shows that being able to argue for a position that you do not personally adhere to is a valuable quality to have if you want to make it big in Christianity, which, again, doesn't really look good for his position. Anyway, his point here is that Lyell didn't go to school for geology, which is not quite true. His degrees were a BA and an MA in classics, whatever that means, I'm not really looking into it right now, but it included at least a few lecture courses on geology from William Buckland, the man who wrote the first full account of a fossil dinosaur. Now, Lyell certainly did start his career off as a lawyer, but he definitely had some geologic training.
He popularized the concept of uniformitarianism proposed by James Hutton. Now, don't let the big words scare you. Just look at the root word, uniform. It was the idea that all geological processes were uniform, gradual and slow, with no catastrophes.
That is a misleading statement, to say the least. Originally, uniformitarianism was the idea that the processes that are responsible for the major features of the Earth's surface were slow and gradual. The way you phrased it makes it sound like they denied that catastrophes even happen, which is just flat out not true. They just didn't believe that catastrophes played a part in geology. For a while, uniformitarianism won, but in the 20th century it started to become apparent that catastrophes that may be infrequent in terms of human lifespans are relatively common when looked at over long periods of time, so we begin to recognize the impact that catastrophes could have on the geologic record. So now we use what some have dubbed catastrophic uniformitarianism as a combination of the two models. It is important to realize, though, that even in a model with the word catastrophic in the title, there's still no room for a global flood. Recognition that catastrophes happen is not the same as recognizing that one specific physically impossible catastrophe happened.
In my opinion, this uniformitarian geology, though scientifically bankrupt, has been the single most effective weapon ever produced against the Bible.
I hate to break it to you, but if that's true, then the Bible is wrong. Most of what we know about geology has its basis in uniformitarianism, even when the catastrophes are taken into account. So rather than making the entire field of science known as geology something that will break your faith, maybe find a way to work it into the Bible. Like, really, all the information that we've discussed on geology so far can be found within the first 35 pages of a basic textbook on stratigraphy. If you can't read less than 2 chapters into a fairly basic textbook on geology without it completely contradicting your religion, then how could you possibly claim that science is on your side?
Think about it. Did banning the Bible get rid of it?
Who banned the Bible now?
No, in fact, it only caused more demand for the book. Did burning the Bible get rid of it? Nope. Only made people want it all the more.
Okay, sure, that's like the old-timey version of the Streisand effect, where an attempt to suppress knowledge about something has the opposite effect and brings that thing to more people's attention. But what Bible bannings and burnings are you even referring to? Because, interesting thing is, when I looked up Bible burnings on Wikipedia's list of book burning incidents, there are only 5 incidents of Bible burnings listed, 4 of which were carried out by Christian groups trying to suppress the wrong versions of the Bible. Amusingly, one of those 4 was the Amazing Grace Baptist Church of Canton, North Carolina, which intended to burn a bunch of non-King James Bibles, but they got rained out. So I guess if God's watching, he didn't approve of that particular activity. I was actually surprised to learn that the 5th event was carried out by the US military. Apparently a Christian group had translated a bunch of Bibles into a couple local Afghani languages, and was trying to get American soldiers to hand them out and proselytize to the local populations, and when a chaplain found out about it, the Bibles were confiscated and eventually burned. Though I feel like that burning was more just a method of disposal rather than a direct attempt at disrespect and censorship, but even then, the vast majority of American military chaplains are Christian, so odds are that was carried out by Christians as well, though certainly the military is not supposed to be a Christian organization.
It was Lyell who coined the phrase, "the present is the key to the past."
Yeah, the processes that we see acting on the Earth today are largely the same as the ones that would have been operating in the past. Just look at depositional environments. Let's take a river delta, for instance. We see today that when a river empties into a sea or ocean in an area where that sea or ocean is relatively calm, the deposition brought by the river will build up and form a delta. We have no reason to think that this would have been any different in the past. Now, when we look through the geologic strata, we can find rocks that appear to be the result of deposition that makes sense in light of how river deltas deposit sediments. So, given how we know how river deltas deposit sediment, and given that we see sedimentary deposits that look very much like they were deposited in such a manner, does it not follow that we should look at how sediment is being deposited now to help us understand how the sediment in a similar situation in the past would have been deposited? And this is just one example of many, many depositional environments that we find in both the geologic record and in real time today.
How many of you have heard that phrase in your education? That phrase is loaded.
That phrase is an oversimplified explanation of a general principle that explains how we figure out what happens in the past. You want to talk about loaded? You spent the first half of your video baselessly attacking Darwin's education as if that had any relevance to the theory of evolution as we understand it today. That's loaded.
How many of you have seen a global flood recently?
No one. And I know where you're going. The global flood was a one-time thing, so how can we possibly use the present as a way of understanding how the flood would have worked? The answer is because we do know how floods behave, because we do see floods in the present. It's mostly a matter of scaling it up. And we know how sediment behaves in a flood. In fact, most creationist geologists even acknowledge the different depositional environments that we find. They just try to make excuses as to how they all could have formed during a flood, and then they try to present the dry depositional environments as if they were actually underwater somehow, even when there's no actual evidence for such claims. My point is, creationists use the same principle when it suits them, only attacking it when it doesn't give them the results that they like.
Notice that with that one simple, easy-to-remember phrase, he just disqualified a global flood from history because he argues that only present-day processes are allowed to interpret the past.
Well, thing is, it wasn't just that one simple phrase. There was also 3 to 4 volumes of Principles of Geology, depending on which edition you have, and 1 to 2 volumes of Elements of Geology, again depending on the edition, where he went into at least a little bit more detail than that one phrase as to why that position is tenable, not to mention all of Hutton's work that led him to that conclusion in the first place.
You see, one tactic that lawyers use is to not attack their opponent's case head on.
Says the guy 45 minutes into a series on why evolution is wrong, who still hasn't actually provided any reason to believe that evolution is wrong, instead choosing to level personal attacks against a few prominent people who accept evolution.
But rather to provide a believable, alternate explanation for the facts. If you have a murder case with all kinds of evidence pointing to your client as the murderer, you would try to come up with a different story of the events which explains all the facts, which does not even involve your client.
Okay, are you suggesting that evolution was invented by a geologist lawyer specifically to undermine young Earth creationism even though he knew it wasn't correct, and that the scientific community has been on board with this plan ever since? You said you had physical evidence. We're more than halfway through your video. Present some of that instead of attacking credentials or methods of long-dead scientists.
A powerful psychological part of that tactic is to never mention your opponent's arguments or case, because you are trying to distract the jury from your opponent's case.
Well, then I guess my channel, which directly tackles creationist claims and takes creationism head-on while being completely honest about this fact, must not be doing a very good job.
Now, this is an excellent legal tactic, but is it scientific? Hardly.
Again, says the guy who has spent this entire video, and most of the last one, doing nothing but personally attacking prominent people who accept evolution, rather than actually providing evidence for creation or against evolution. Like, we haven't even gotten to cherry-picking and quote mining yet. You have not said a single substantive sentence in this series yet.
Notice, he ruled out possible scientific conclusions from consideration and ruled out huge amounts of scientific evidence from the research and modeling before the scientific hypothesis was even formulated.
So you claim. I know it's unthinkable to creationists, but I'm pretty sure that he didn't start his career in geology off with the statement that the present is the key to the past. That was his conclusion after examining the evidence. But that's not how creationists do things, so they have a hard time imagining anyone else working in that way when they themselves can't.
The present cannot be the key to the past because present-day processes cannot explain what we find in the geological record.
You have got to be kidding me. Like, if you're going to admit that looking at the geologic record is how we would determine whether or not the processes that we see happening today could be responsible for what we find there, how can you possibly assert that Lyell started off with the assumption that the present was the key to the past instead of coming to that as a conclusion? Maybe, just maybe, he looked at the geologic record and realized that what we see happening today could be responsible for what he found there, and so he concluded as the result of his observations that the present is the key to the past.
I would instead contend the Bible is the key to the past.
A book that is demonstrably wrong when it comes to science on a number of occasions, and history for that matter. Tell me, when in Roman history did any emperor conduct an empire-wide census that would have had people traveling to the birthplace of their ancient ancestors? Oh, that was never done because it would be functionally, physically, and logistically impossible? Well, the Bible says it happened, so it must have happened.
Now, including it as the frontispiece of every edition of his book, he obviously considered this site significant to his new history.
Yes, the reason he included that picture in his book was because it is an excellent demonstration of one of the ideas his book was presenting. At the time, most geologists just accepted that the Earth was largely fixed. Nobody thought about the idea that mountains could grow. They were just there. That site shows evidence of having sunken and then having been uplifted. Notably, the markings that clams made on the columns, which stopped abruptly near the bottoms of the pillars. This is because sediment from the ground washed up against the pillars in a way that indicated that it was not brought in by flooding, but by a depression of the land that the pillars are on. With the observation that this area of land could sink into the water and then rise out of the water again, it now becomes possible to conceptualize the idea of mountains forming if the processes that cause such elevation could continue for long periods of time.
So when Lyell saw this, he was understandably thrilled. Here he was able to point to a series of historic events with profound significance. You see, in his day, everyone knew that the layers of rock we find all over the world were all the result of the great flood of Noah.
I don't actually know if they had begun to use Noah's flood to explain the sedimentary layers yet. It's possible. After all, I know that creationists have been using the flood to explain fossilized sea creatures on the mountaintop since at least Da Vinci's time, so maybe they were. But it doesn't matter. Lyell was working in the infancy of the geologic sciences. There were many different camps that believed many different things. Any of them could have come out on top had they ended up being true. But Lyell's explanations withstood the test of time, while others did not. I wonder why creationists don't champion William Buckland's geologic ideas. They included a Noachian flood. He even published a best-selling book explaining his views of geology in light of the biblical accounts. Could it be that he, 20 years later, admitted that there was no geologic evidence for Noah's flood? But that story looks almost like someone who started out agreeing with the creationists that there was a flood, but then changed their mind when presented with the appropriate evidence. Not a good look for creationists, but it does raise the question, why do the creationist geologists like Snelling, Baumgartner, and Austin all make use of uniformitarianism when doing their work for creationist organizations? If all of uniformitarianism is wrong, and the guy who came up with it just made it up in order to have something else to replace the true catastrophic explanation with, then why do even creationists use uniformitarianism when working, instead of one of the catastrophic models that competed with uniformitarianism back when Lyell was still around?
Lyell sought to replace this thinking with his new history of deep time.
Did he? Let's see how Richard Fortey explains the transition from a young Earth to deep time.
Lyell saw sedimentary processes now, and he saw how much sediment accumulated in a given time, and he realized just how much sediment there was if you piled all the geological successions that were known one on top of another. And you could do a crude estimate of how old the world was, and you would immediately go into millions.
That sounded more like an examination of the evidence followed by the conclusion, rather than the conclusion driving the way in which you present the evidence, which seems to be what you are suggesting that he did.
So here he had this historic structure which, due to local subsurface volcanic activity, had dramatically sunk below sea level. Sediments had washed in, forming layers of sediments just like we see all over the world. Then, just as dramatically, the land rose again above sea level. So we didn't need a whole worldwide flood to produce these sedimentary layers we see all over the world.
You completely missed the point of using that area as an example. It wasn't that floods can produce sediments. In fact, we know that they can and do. Specifically for that picture, it was the idea that the very land itself could sink and then rise again. That was a revolutionary idea that completely changed how geologists looked at the world, and that location is an exemplification of that idea.
It could be done with subsidence. He argued that, contrary to what the Bible says, the seas didn't rise, the land sunk.
No. You're making it sound like Lyell's idea was that all sediment was formed by land sinking underwater. That is completely and utterly false. He did not use a picture in the front of his book to demonstrate that everything he was going to describe in the book would be an identical situation to the location that that picture was from. It was just an illustration of his main point, namely that the Earth changes over time and is not static. I know you're looking at his book as his desperate attempt to prove creationism wrong, but he was actually just trying to understand how geology works. He wasn't concerned with creationism, just evidence. Speaking of evidence, you've got less than 4 minutes left in your video in which you claimed to have physical evidence. Are you actually going to bring some of that up? Or is this it? Because you're still attacking Lyell here rather than anything to do with modern geology, because at the end of the day, even if your gross, negligent mischaracterization of Lyell's groundbreaking, pun intended, work were correct, all that would mean is that another 19th century geologist was wrong about geology. How does that do anything to disprove or discredit anything about modern geology?
Now, there was, several problems with Lyell's proposition. Number one, if you sink the land below sea level, what do you get? A flood.
No, it's not actually physically possible to sink all the land on the planet underneath sea level at any one time, because there isn't enough water for that to happen.
Secondly, this dramatic subsidence of the land was catastrophic in nature, in complete contradiction to the deep time Lyell was trying to claim, and a perfect example of historic catastrophe.
Wow. Just wow. I haven't read Lyell's Principles, so I'm not going to fault you for not having read it either, but you don't even seem to have read just a basic summary of it. Like, Lyell didn't propose anything like that anywhere in it. So, yeah, good job knocking down that straw man, I guess. Now, go do some homework and come back and address some of the things that geologists actually believe happened, like the layers of sediment all through the Grand Canyon that show evidence of multiple inland seas having covered the area and then receded, the semi-arid environments found in the top layers, the evidence of organisms having gone about their normal lives, building burrows and such, right in the middle of the record that you claim was created in a massive catastrophe that wouldn't have allowed them to build burrows and whatnot. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Foppish Dilettante, who says, "My toaster failed to stop toasting my toaster pastry, and it suffered apoptosis." I have nothing to add to that.
And so ends part 2. Part 3 begins now.
Hello, and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today, I'm continuing on with Ian Juby's Complete Creation series, and I'm starting to have suspicions. I've been getting these videos from a channel called Wazulu, and they're all low quality, like 360p videos with audio bugs and everything. And usually in cases like that, where there are pretty severe-ish quality problems on a channel with some nonsense word as a name, it's just some rando uploading bootlegs. But I think Wazulu is actually Ian Juby's channel. Either that or whoever runs it has put a lot of effort into making it look that way. I don't know, this guy's kinda sus. Anyway, I know I said last time that I wasn't planning on going through all these videos and taking them in order, but this is actually the next one in the series. You see, he brings up Niagara Falls, and since I drive right past Niagara Falls on the regular and have had jobs where Niagara Falls is the view out the window, that caught my attention. So I couldn't bring myself to just skip a part where he hits so close to home in such a literal sense. So let's go!
Hello again and welcome back. In the previous lecture we were looking at the surprising foundations in history of the creation-evolution debate.
Yeah, that is what you did. If you'll recall with me for a moment, to summarize, if every word that Ian Juby spoke was true, that would have no impact on the modern theory of evolution. However, his statements were full of half-truths, obfuscations, loaded language, and either ignorance or outright lies, depending on how you look at it. It was a half-hour video that could have been adequately responded to by my simply asking, "So what?" But that wouldn't have been interesting for you guys to watch, so I actually went through the whole thing.
As I previously mentioned, Lyell spent himself traveling the world, looking for evidence to back up his new history.
Yeah, he did travel a lot after he wrote his book, but as with most scientists, he wasn't looking for evidence to back up his previously drawn conclusion, as creationists do. He was studying various aspects of geology and giving lectures.
One of those places visited was Niagara Falls.
Woo! Yeah! Niagara Falls! That's near where I'm from!
In 1841. If you ever get the chance to visit the Niagara Falls, I highly recommend it.
Just stay away from Clifton Hill, that place is a money pit. Though, the dinosaur mini-putt with the fiery volcano is pretty fun.
You can notice several significant things. Take the journey behind the falls, which are tunnels at the bottom of the falls and in behind.
Do it on the Canadian side, though. You have to come to the Canadian side to get any of the good attractions, not to mention the better view. Anytime the falls shows up in movies and TV shows, they're always on the Canadian side, largely because of this.
Besides spectacular scenery, when you are at the base of the falls, look in behind the falling water. Notice there is a bit of a cave forming behind the falls. Now there's a couple of different kinds of rock involved here. There is a limestone layer at the top and shale at the bottom. Limestone is a fairly tough rock. It is actually the rock from which we get concrete, so think of it like concrete. The shale is a very soft, fine-grained sediment which has basically been compacted together into a rock.
Yeah, basically. And that combination is why we can say things like the falls erode backward at so many centimeters per year, when it doesn't actually look like it's going anywhere. Because it erodes the softer rock in the bottom, and then there will be a large rock slide as the harder limestone at the top crumbles over after the supporting shale is eroded away.
As the falls continuously move backwards upstream towards Lake Erie, the Niagara Gorge is left behind. The falls and gorge started here at the Niagara Escarpment.
Yes, this is a fact that is accepted by creationists as well. Niagara Falls is the force that carved the gorge, and the falls started at Queenston Heights, where this steep incline of the Niagara Escarpment was, and still is today. My point is, even creationists agree that the gorge has been carved by the falls over thousands of years. The dispute is over how many thousands of years.
So when Lyell visited the falls, ye old gears in his head must have been turning. Here was the perfect clock that he could call upon. A modern day, observable, repeatable process that he could call upon in his book to bolster his new history.
I don't really think so. I'm going to wait for you to get further into it before I bring up what Lyell actually wrote about the falls, but suffice it to say for now that he wasn't just looking for things that could make the Earth look old, he was simply making observations.
Get an idea of how slowly the falls are moving backward over time, measure the length of the gorge, and extrapolate the age of the gorge by dividing the length of the gorge by the erosion rate.
It's not quite as simple as that, and Lyell knew that it wasn't that simple, as we will soon see.
So, in the name of proper and good science, did he study and measure the erosion rates over time, to get a good handle on the erosion rate?
Himself? No, he was just visiting. However, he was working closely with American geologist James Hall, and Lyell assisted Hall with his work in being the first to conduct an accurate survey of the rim of the falls, which would then be used several times in the future to measure the erosion rate using specific landmarks from Hall's survey. So he may not have taken the measurements himself at the time, but he helped develop the map that would be used to take those measurements in the future.
Yeah, right. Oh, no. He instead asked the locals what they thought.
Not really. I mean, yeah, he used one of Mr. Bakewell's calculations of 1 yard per year for the 40 years preceding 1830, but you make it sound like he just wandered up to some random local guy and said, "Hey, how fast do these falls move back?" Which is absolutely not how it happened.
Now, he did find one man who told him, "Well, I've been eyeballing a tree from this side to that tree on the other side of the gorge, and I'd estimate it probably be eroding at about 3 feet per year."
I would be willing to bet that that's not a great description of how Bakewell performed his calculation, but I'll let it slide as I can't really find anything detailing exactly how he did perform the calculation.
So, did Lyell use the locals' wild guess in his book? Yeah, right. Oh, no. That simply would not serve his secret purposes of refuting the biblical history in the minds of people and replacing history with his story. No, he assumed the local was exaggerating and wrote that the falls were eroding at 1 foot per year.
Okay, now it's time to look at what Lyell himself wrote about this exchange. Mr. Bakewell calculated that in the 40 years preceding 1830, the Niagara had been going back at the rate of about a yard annually, but I conceived that 1 foot per year would be a much more probable conjecture, in which case 35,000 years would have been required for the retreat of the falls from the escarpment of Queenston to their present site, if we could assume that the retrograde movement had been uniform throughout. Well,
Just this by itself does look a little bit damning. After all, he's admitting that it's conjecture, and that there is an assumption that the erosional rate was uniform. But let's just read a little bit further, shall we? This, however, could not have been the case, as at every step in the process of excavation, the height of the precipice, the hardness of the materials at its base, and the quantity of fallen matter to be removed must have varied. At some points it must have receded much faster than at present, at others much slower, and it would be scarcely possible to decide whether its average progress has been more or less rapid than now. Shocker of shockers, it turns out that scientists are often aware of situations that are not perfectly uniform indefinitely. Juby is presenting this as though Lyell must have thought that the recession rate of the falls was uniform, because Lyell promoted uniformitarian geology. Except uniformitarian does not mean that all things are constant in the past. Lyell was perfectly aware that different situations would have a different result. Uniformitarianism is not a belief that all observable processes happen at the same rates indefinitely into the past, regardless of any other variability. It's just that the processes that we see today would be the same processes that happened in the past, and they obey the same laws of nature that we see today.
From there, it was simple math. He wrote that a 35,000-foot gorge eroding at 1 foot per year was 35,000 years old, and the Earth could not possibly be 6,000 years old.
Well, as I pointed out, when you read it in Lyell's own words, he isn't trying to disprove creationism. Hell, he isn't even trying to give an accurate age for the falls. This was merely a guesstimation in a book recounting his travels in North America, not a scientific publication, essentially just a story. Yeah, the story included a back-of-the-envelope style calculation, but it is never presented as anything other than a conjecture, and no conclusions are drawn based on this number.
You see, everyone in Lyell's day knew that, according to the biblical account, the Earth was only around 6,000 to 10,000 years old.
You know, I really wish creationists would stop making that sound like some indisputable fact. Like, the Bible doesn't actually say anything about how old the Earth is. That's a calculation based on genealogies found in the Bible and the assumption that Genesis is literal. It is a guesstimation that is no better than Lyell's guesstimation of a 35,000-year age for Niagara Falls.
So Lyell once again put his cunning lawyer's tactic to use in his writing about the Niagara Gorge. He never mentioned the Bible.
Why would he? He was studying geology. What does the Bible say about geology? Nothing. So why would he talk about the Bible in a book on geology?
He simply used a modern-day process in claiming that the gorge was 35,000 years old and the Earth couldn't possibly be 6,000 years old.
Well, you're talking about the story of an event that happened in 1841 as though it were printed in his book that was published in 1830, so I decided to look it up. Turns out, this story was added into one of his later editions of the book, and it's pretty much the same thing. With his back-of-the-envelope calculation, you'd get an age of 35,000 years, but he fully admits that this is a rough estimate and that better data would be needed to make a more accurate calculation.
Everyone who read Lyell's book knew what he had just done. He flat out refuted the Bible.
I mean, he did, but not with Niagara Falls.
Even though he never mentioned it.
Yeah, it's funny how an unbiased presentation of facts, data, and evidence ends up refuting a literal interpretation of the Bible. Almost as though a literal interpretation of the Bible is not backed up by facts, data, and evidence.
So, whose erosion estimate was right? Lyell's? Or the local man who claimed 3 feet per year?
Doesn't matter. It is what it is, regardless of whether or not these two people, both of whom were working from bad data, ended up at a close-ish number with their calculation. I mean, really, as Lyell pointed out numerous times, the actual erosion rate would have varied. But if we just want to do back-of-the-envelope calculations, we know from other data that Niagara Falls is about 12,500 years old. It has moved a distance of about 11 kilometers in that time, giving us an average erosion rate of 88 centimeters per year, or 2.8 feet. So just by straight up looking at the average erosion rate, Bakewell was closer to being correct, but this turns out to be irrelevant because of the whole, knowing its age from different methods thing.
Well, as it turns out, neither. When actual, true science was conducted and the erosion rates were actually measured, the rates were discovered to be closer to 5 feet per year.
I'd be interested to see where you figured that out, because what I'm finding is that the average rate of erosion from 1842 to 1905 was 1.16 meters per year, or 3.8 feet, and from 1906 to 1927 it was down to 70 centimeters per year, or 2.3 feet. And starting in 1906, we humans started building things specifically to combat erosion, not to mention diverting water for electricity generation, so the erosion rate has been much slower ever since. Point is, I have never seen an estimate anywhere close to 5 feet per year.
Lyell convinced countless numbers of people around the world that this book was fiction, when in fact it was his science that was fiction.
I just love the smug look on your face as you proudly proclaim a completely unjustified, "Nuh-uh, it was you that wasn't being scientific."
You could not even call Lyell's research flawed, because he didn't do any research. His report was dishonest at best.
Who is more dishonest? The guy who wrote plainly that his rough calculations were based on conjecture and could very well be wrong given the different circumstances that the river would have been in the past? Or the guy who presents this rough calculation based on conjecture as though it were supposed to have been the definitive work on the matter when nobody was using it as such?
And had he accurately reported using actual erosion rates of the day, his extrapolation would have placed an age of about 7,000 years old on the gorge.
Nope, not even close. 3 feet is 91 centimeters. If it eroded 91 centimeters per year, then it would take 12,088 years to erode that distance. In order to fit with the creation model, where the falls would have had to have been created no earlier than 4,000 years ago, you have to be comfortable with a margin of error of 200%. Remember my last video when I was talking about reasons why creationist papers don't often get published in reputable journals? Stuff like this is why. Ask any scientist if a 200% margin of error is acceptable and see what their answer is.
It would have been seen by readers as affirming the biblical history.
I'm not sure how finding that a natural feature is 3 times older than it's possible for it to be if the Bible is accurate supports the Bible. I'm skipping a bit now. He rambles a bunch about Louis Hennepin, the first European to draw a picture of the falls. He takes a really long time to say that he went to the spot where Hennepin would have viewed the falls from, and he presents Hennepin's drawing of the falls looking very different than it does today, as evidence that the falls have eroded really quickly in recent times. I think that's what he's going for. I'm not sure what conclusions he expects to be drawn from this, but just listen to how he talks about this drawing.
Most historians have written off Hennepin's drawing as exaggerated and drawn years after the fact from memory.
I don't know whether or not it was drawn years after the fact, and actually I think it probably was, given that Hennepin's trip to the falls was in 1678, like Juby has displayed there, but the drawing wasn't published until Hennepin included it in his book, New Discovery, which was published in 1697, 19 years later. But regardless of whether it was drawn from memory or from him standing right there looking at it, it was most definitely exaggerated. Hennepin described the falls as being 600 feet tall, which, given its actual height of 177 feet, is a definite exaggeration. Unless you want to suggest that somehow the entire top of the gorge all eroded evenly with the falls over the last 300 years? Otherwise, there would be a rather steep incline there, which just doesn't exist.
Hogwash! The only reason they say that is because the falls in Hennepin's drawing do not look anything like they do today.
I mean, it's really more that he described them with numbers that can't possibly be accurate. We know the falls look different. Lyell himself commented on the rocks of the falls collapsing in the early 1800s, giving the horseshoe a more pronounced curve. But sure, go ahead and pretend that we thought the falls of 300 years ago would have looked identical to today's falls if you want. It doesn't help your case, though.
That is an El Lamo excuse to reject the accuracy of this drawing.
So let me get this straight. You don't like that Lyell used an estimate given to him by the locals to base his estimated erosion rate on, all while being completely honest about the speculative nature of his estimations, because his ultimate source was just to talk to guys that were there. But you want to propose, as counter-evidence, a picture possibly drawn almost 2 decades after Hennepin observed the falls, which describes the falls as being higher than it was possible for them to be. And that is good evidence because what? Is it because you think it helps your case, whereas Lyell's observations do not help your case? That looks a lot like cherry-picking to me.
Now, one might say my assumptions are on shaky ground. my assumption that Hennepin's drawing is accurate and that we can estimate erosion rates based on that drawing. But you see, that's the thing. Charles Lyell had absolutely zero excuse to A, not conduct actual scientific measurements of erosion rates, or B, to not include the measurements that had already been conducted.
There's a few things here. First and foremost, one geologist in the past made questionable assumptions and thereby arrived at the wrong answer, therefore I'm perfectly justified in making even wilder assumptions based on even worse data, is an absolutely terrible way to present your argument. This is essentially the "I know you are, but what am I" of arguments. Secondly, Lyell was there helping to set up a survey with the purpose of scientifically and accurately measuring the erosion rates, which leads to the third. The scientific measurement had not been conducted yet. All he had to go on was Bakewell's guess that it was about 3 feet per year. That's it. There were no measurements. Anytime I've looked up the erosion rate of the falls, I always find people giving numbers of the average erosion rate since 1842, because that's when the survey that Lyell helped set up was completed. You are literally standing here criticizing the guy that helped set up the survey that would allow us to directly and accurately measure the erosion rate of the falls for the first time, for not having used the measurements that didn't even exist when he was there.
That's right. There was plenty of data around decades before Lyell ever came along. This map was the first ever actual map produced by a survey.
But did that survey include a survey of the rim of the falls? I'm willing to bet no, seeing as how everyone else references Hall's 1842 survey as being the first.
His survey did not include scale, and his surveys and maps were based on longitude and latitude.
So what? We're supposed to figure out the erosion rate from a survey that didn't even use an accurate scale with which to estimate distances? And this is supposed to help your case?
However, this map is still very enlightening. Notice the island, which parts the falls, parts the two falls. It's long and narrow, pointing only slightly away from due north, and almost parallel with the gorge. This is in stark contrast to the modern-day Goat Island, which is a wide island whose longitudinal axis runs almost due east-west.
Okay, he harps on this a lot. I'm not sure why. He brought it up in Hennepin's drawing as well. He does eventually claim that this is what Luna Island, a small island just north of Goat Island, looked like in Hennepin's day, but I can only find references to Hennepin talking about fir trees on Goat Island, but I can't confirm that this is referring to the large island in his drawing, so I don't know if the island there was supposed to be Luna Island or Goat Island. But one thing is sure, it doesn't matter. We are aware of the rock slides that altered the appearance of the falls in the early 1800s, but when calculating the average erosion rates over time, using a short period of time that is known to include a significant and unusual erosional event is a dishonest tactic at best.
Ellicott's map lines up with Hennepin's drawing, quite remarkably. Also bear in mind, at this time, the volume of water flowing over the falls was at least 2 to perhaps 5 times the modern-day volume, and possibly more.
Is it even possible to be less specific than that? It was 2 to as much as 5 times the volume, maybe even more. So basically, any amount of water that is more than twice today's amount is within your range? And yes, depending on where you're measuring, we've decreased the water flow over the falls anywhere from 40 to 90%, which is very significant, and it's both to generate electricity and it's specifically to prevent erosion. This isn't some big gotcha that people are trying to keep a secret. It is known.
It is known.
It is known.
As a result, there was radical changes in the shorelines, as can be seen when you comparing Ellicott's map to the modern day riverbed.
Yeah, I don't think anyone is suggesting that there haven't been changes to the river. Again, Lyell mentioned this himself right before his estimation of how fast it erodes on average, pointing out that Goat Island has lost several acres over just 4 years. You know, that island that you bring up saying it can't be Goat Island because it looks different from modern-day Goat Island? Well, apparently it lost several acres in just 4 years, and it was Lyell pointing this out. If it could lose so much in so short a time, why couldn't it also be eroded from what is shown on Ellicott's map to what it is today in over 2 centuries?
I'm skipping the rest of this one. This whole argument just amounts to, why didn't Lyell calculate a steady erosion rate based on where the falls were before the known rockslide events of 1814 and 1828? Like, a rockslide is an event that can drastically change the shape and location of a waterfall. We know this. Lyell knew this. It's not rocket science, so to choose this as a hill to die on just seems weird.
Erosion rates by water volume are exponential. We know the river volume was at least 2 times higher in the past than today's rates because we diverted 50% to 80% of the water of volume around the falls.
Yes, which is one of the reasons why, when you look up what the erosion rate of the falls actually is, you find websites that divide that number up by time periods. 1.16 meters per year from 1842 to 1905, 0.7 meters per year from 1906 to 1927, and less than 30 centimeters per year for the Horseshoe Falls, and about 30 centimeters every 10 years for the American Falls today. Notice that the data starts at 1842. Where have I heard that year before? Oh yeah, that's the year that Hall published his survey that was the first to even attempt to measure the erosion rate. The survey that Lyell assisted with. Funny how that keeps coming up. Also, I find it interesting that one of us keeps bringing up actual data from surveys that were meant to measure this exact thing, while the other keeps going to pictures that are known to be exaggerated, using them to loosely figure out where the falls might have been back then on a modern map, ignoring the 2 major rock slides of the early 1800s, and then calculating ridiculous erosion rates based on that. Not to mention ignoring the several times when Lyell explicitly mentioned his awareness of all these data points, while pretending the whole time that he was ignoring it in order to push a narrative.
If you double the flow volume of a river, erosion rates increase by 4 times or more. This does not take into account the possibility of extremely high flow rates in the ancient past because of the meltback of Ice Age glaciers, which could have produced a dramatic increase in water volume.
Just you try and find me a secular source for the formation of the falls that doesn't mention the Ice Age. I dare you. It's not possible, because the last glacial maximum played some important parts in the history of Niagara Falls, not the least of which was an increase in water volume. Also, bear in mind that comparing the older natural erosion rate to today's let's try everything we can to stop it from eroding erosion rate is going to be misleading. Like, the modern erosion rate of the American Falls is 3 centimeters per year. That's 38 times less than the average erosion rate between 1842 and 1905. And you're telling me that having a faster erosion rate than today is supposed to be a problem when this data is right out there for anyone to find?
If you visit the Falls and Gorge today, and I highly recommend you do so, you can actually see the different rock types in the layering exposed in the gorge.
Different rock types that couldn't possibly have formed in one singular catastrophic flooding event. Remember the shale? Oh wait, you do remember the shale.
The softer shales thicken considerably while the limestone thins.
Right. So if what you're saying is correct, then down the gorge from the falls, the shale is thicker. But shale needs calm water in order to form. It is made up of small-grained sediments, so it is necessary for the water to remain calm, thereby allowing the larger-grained sandy sediments time to settle and be deposited before the smaller-grained sediments that eventually make up the shale have time to settle. Shale could not possibly have been formed by the global flood. The floodwaters would have been far too catastrophic. So what this comes down to is that even if every single thing that Juby has said in this video is correct, the flood still didn't happen. It would just mean that Niagara Falls is younger than we thought it was. This is exactly what I'm talking about when I mention that creation relies entirely on attempting to poke holes in other theories rather than actually presenting their own evidence. In order for creationism to even make an attempt at appearing scientific, they first have to completely discredit several other well-supported and well-understood fields of science. And since there is no evidence in favor of creationism, aside from what it says in the Bible, they have to spend all of their time trying to poke holes in what they see as evolutionist science. I am entirely unaware of any creationist argument that doesn't end up either saying this well-established science is wrong, without providing any reason to believe their hypothesis as an alternative, or just flat out God of the gaps, we haven't figured out X yet, therefore it must be creation. So ask yourself this. Compare myself to Ian Juby. Which of us had to ignore huge chunks of the other side's data in order to present their case?
Which conclusions are more likely to be accurate? Those that need to ignore a bunch of stuff in order to get there, or those that can safely and fully examine all sides?
So the falls would have eroded the gorge at far faster rates than the modern rates measured in the Forteys, because the water would have had way thinner limestone to work and far more of the softer shales to erode.
Yeah, if only someone back in 1842 could have been there to say that at some points it must have receded much faster than at present, and at others much slower, and it would be scarcely possible to decide whether its average progress had been more or less rapid than now. Oh, wait a minute. That's an exact direct quote from what Lyell said. Now I'm skipping his bit about St. David's Gorge. He just takes a long time explaining that there used to be a gorge there that was filled in by a glacier. If you want to read about it, I'll leave a link down below, but he just asserts that the river carved the gorge to the whirlpool in a matter of weeks and then moves on as if he's demonstrated something.
Lyell was without excuse for what he published in his book that misled countless numbers into discounting this book as a literal history book and embracing his fictitious story of deep time.
If, hey, here's a rough estimate for the age of a feature for which we currently have no accurate estimates, and it's about 35,000 years, but we can't actually know this with any certainty due to the variability of the geology of the gorge, is enough to dismantle the Bible's whole story, then maybe instead of trying to poke holes in 2 centuries old geology books, you should instead focus more on strengthening your own position.
Now, you can call Lyell's work and writings anything you want, as long as you don't use words like good work, accurate, scientific, or honest,
says the guy who is forced to ignore a good chunk of Lyell's work in order to make it appear to be wrong. Again, to reiterate, Lyell pointed out explicitly that his numbers were not meant to be taken as authoritative. How is that not honest?
Lyell deliberately, and I would say deceitfully, convinced countless numbers that this book was fiction, when in fact it was Lyell's book that was fiction, and consequently the deep time beliefs.
No, that's not how that works. Lyell didn't set out to disprove the biblical timeline. It just so happens that he did. Though certainly not by using Niagara Falls. Lyell's book also was not fiction. Certainly he didn't get everything right, but finding one of those inaccuracies and then misrepresenting how that inaccuracy was initially presented does not render the whole book fiction. And finally, we have plenty of reasons to accept the fact that the Earth and universe are both billions of years old, which have nothing to do with anything that Lyell wrote. So even if Lyell was wrong about everything, that would not render the conclusions of deep time false.
The Niagara Gorge, if used as a uniformitarian clock, actually affirms the biblical timeline, as the gorge is demonstrably very young.
I noticed that through this whole video, Juby has not once actually provided an age for the falls using any of his calculation methods. He leaves that up to implication. I wonder if that's because he knows that all of the evidence suggests that Niagara Falls is over 12,000 years old, which suggests to me that the omissions in this video are not deliberate lies, but rather the typical creationist laziness when it comes to checking sources. He read on a creationist website about the story that Lyell met a local and guesstimated the erosion rate from that conversation, and didn't look any deeper than that. Had he actually read Lyell's book and then gone to give this presentation, that would be deliberate deception, but if he's okay with deliberate deception, he would be able to come out and say that the falls are only 4,000 years old. But he can't seem to bring himself to do that, which leads me to believe that he is lazy and ignorant rather than deceptive. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Jerry the Berry, David Schinkel, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the rocks that fall off the waterfall that is my channel. If you'd like creationists to ignore you while simultaneously using you to prove creation, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!